House recognizes the Leader of Opposition.
We walked back in. The room was quiet, empty and bare. 3 people sat with yellow papers that told us what our decision was, who we were, if we had achieved a victory. We were successful, failures, moving on, moving back. More importantly, one person started to speak. They told us that they were the one who disagreed, the one who thought we were breaking down the system, destroying debate, hurting other people, taking the rounds around us and driving them into a spiral of failure, indeterminability, vagueness, and in the end, nothingness. The other 2 judges thankfully disagreed, but in the end, we were told that we were bad people for what we did in the round, not for what we said in the round, not for what we argued, but for the way in which we labeled it, for the way in which we performed it, for the way in which we decided to engage. Exclusion. DA. To reject based on form requires the refusal to engage or dissect. The internal warrant. No analysis of internal validity is ever necessary when form is dissected and rejected based merely on the labeling on the top of the position. Because I decide that my performance is a performance, that doesn't mean that a judge has the right, a community has the right, to reject it because they refuse to analyze my internal analysis, how I function, how the round is analyzed, or even more importantly, how on the flow you can determine what a performance means, how I do solve for long-term problems, maybe how I break down the system through my analysis. The 2 points. We see that normative presumption always checks in this instance. The only time when we see exclusion actually occurring is when it's anti-normative. The only time when I'm breaking down debate is when I'm not what debate should be, when I'm not that majority consensus within the room. I go to Wyoming and suddenly my performance is normative. It is okay. I come to PCSFA and guess what? I'm not normative any longer. I become part of the excluded class, the excluded individual, the voice which is not worthy of recognition, of understanding. The impacts. This automatically homogenizes the way in which we discuss information because we are told that there is only one form which is acceptable. The textual, the subtextual, the intellectual. We are not given any kind of division between what is the form and how the form necessarily denigrates the actual argument with it. The second impact on this is we say it automatically calls for intervention. Because just like there's no bright line on ground in some performance, there's no bright line on a lot of intervention. At what point do I cross that boundary and suddenly lose your ballot because I perform? Because I reject?
Yeah, like where in our PMC are we saying that we shouldn't allow performance? We're just saying performance is a really crappy way of debating. Like, we're not saying you aren't allowed to, we're just saying it's not good debate.
But the rejection intrinsically calls for a disallowment. Whenever we say reject, whenever we say this is bad, we set the, like you talk about this room, when we reach that decision, there are a lot of judges in here who go to their next round with the conclusion, the arguments, everything presented here as the framework. For the next round they enter, every time you perform, all of the impacts that you have argued that the other team never articulates, frame their decision. Become the reasons they vote against a team without ever actually hearing them from the teams within the round. The B point. Engagement is crucial to understanding and deconstructing. The 1. If you can beat them, beat them. Don't rely on a judge to do it for you. If you think their framework is wanky, then tell them it's wanky. If you think their performance is indeterminable, then tell them it's indeterminable. But engage in the argumentation. Do not reject it, but engage it. That's what's important, is the differentiation between rejection and engagement. Only when we begin to break down the internal warrants of exactly how performance functions can we ever actually hope to achieve any understanding of what it does. The 2 point under this. It's unfair to explain, if it is unfair, explain why and address the unfairness. If there's some failure to divide ground, then it is your duty to point that out, or even further, to call for clarification. To merely default to the fact that performance is inadmissible doesn't give you access to exactly what's happening. The impacts. First, everyone knows I love it, Millsian democracy. Millsian democracy requires an engagement of the other to create a concept of the self-identity. Any time in which we refuse to engage the other, we entrench ourselves in the belief that we are intrinsically right. Only when we engage the other do we create the sense of self, because we understand the response and how it does or does not fit into our view of the world. The minute that we start to refuse other worldviews, we don't ever actually achieve change in what we believe, or ever conform or disconform from what we believe is right. The second impact. We tell you that debate's theoretical integrity relies on the rejection of exclusion of argument based on form. Form should not be the determining way in which argument functions. Argument is based on content, not on the way in which it exists. C. Debates and arguments vary beyond conception, and thus different strokes for different folks. The 1 point. Civil rights legislators, specifically when fighting from Southern senators, use the N-word frequently in their calls for equal rights for African Americans. If we rejected their statements based on form rather than function, then we fail to understand exactly how they interact with the public sphere. The second argument on this is we say different approaches allow different people to engage and educate themselves in their own ways. I'm an engineer. I have a drastically different way of understanding this round than Peter does as a philosophy major. So if we get a drama major that decides to come in and perform an argument, why can we reject them because their educative sphere falls outside of the one in which we define ourselves? I'm sorry, I'll get to it at the bottom. The impacts. First, this eliminates people from the activity. We drive away the individuals that don't fall into the argumentative exclusive sphere, right? Because we define exclusion criteria. You can't come because you don't speak our language. The second impact, we say this linearizes education. We create only one kind of education, the kind of education advocated by the PMC. There's no diversification, there's no understanding of how education interacts with other forms. The third impact, it tells the individuals that don't fit in that they have no place. And if they do have a place, it sure as hell isn't here. The problem with that is it drives individuals, especially when we're talking about debate as a whole, away from any kind of hope at achieving the argument that they're looking for. Inclusion, the 8th. Performance debate is accessible to all, the 1. There's no different in argument, just a parallel in method in formation. We say that there's a formation of argument through a new form, so there's no internal difference between arguments of the textual and the subtextual. The second, we say, there's different methods of engaging and understanding performance. Guess what? Rounds are on the internet. People talk about their positions because performance creates an understanding and engagement sphere, something that goes beyond a single round and into a season. The impacts on this. We say it levels the playing field for a few reasons. First, debate has become a very exclusionary activity. It's like policy or faster, or in policy we see exclusion of programs that can't cut cards fast enough, teams that can't produce the burdens of evidence, which say a team with 50 teams can produce in 4 hours, what a team with 2 produces in an entire season. This means that burdens of textual claims will always outweigh teams without the funding or resources to overwhelm. The second one on this is we say performance allows a greater amount of involvement by schools that may not be able to afford the startup of a traditional program. So we see that CSUF Fullerton engages in performative debate and does so successfully by using the same kind of argumentation but in a different format. This becomes really important because what we have to understand is that education becomes a subtextual interaction between what we believe and the framework, rather than what we say and what they do.